Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to day 2 of the 19th Annual Kentucky Alternative Education Summit. We're so glad that you're here. We have another great program planned for you today. I know you all probably, I hope you enjoyed yesterday. We had a great turnout. We had wonderful sessions all day, amazing featured keynote speakers, and we're really excited about all of the wonderful things that happened yesterday, and so glad that you're back with us today. We're going to have another busy day today. We have a lot of things going on. We have two whole group instructors who are with us today who are going to do a great job, I'm sure. And then we also have breakouts throughout the day. Just remind you as we are getting ready to start that the links to all of those individual breakouts are in your program. So just like yesterday, all you need to do is just click on that link and it'll take you directly into those sessions roughly about 15 minutes before they are scheduled to start. So please, if you have any questions about that, Sherry Klusky in our office is available to answer any of those questions today. So please reach out to Sherry. She's our designated point person for any kind of troubleshooting that happens today. So keep your eyes and ears open for that as well. Welcome back again, as I said. Just a couple of reminders as we go through the day. Yesterday, I think we emerged relatively unscathed through the day, but I'll remind you that please keep your microphones on mute as you join our meetings, and we'll have another successful day. So just keep that in your mind as well. I also want to thank our sponsors once again, the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice and the Kentucky Department of Education, both wonderful sponsors of this event, who with their support were able to have so many wonderful speakers and engage so effectively, I think, with folks using this new platform that is a new and emerging platform for us in delivering professional development services. But we're really excited about the sponsorship and the work that those two agencies have done with us to help put this on. So thank you to both of those sponsoring agencies. Also, as we talk about those sponsors, we're going to go ahead and get directly into our program this morning because we have a lot of information we want to share with you. But I'll remind you at the end of the program, we do have, because this is a long day, we have some guided stretching and some yoga that's going to happen right at the end of this session. Natalie Deering is going to be with us, so feel free to participate in that as soon as this ends. She'll guide us through just some stuff to keep us a little bit moving because we know you're going to be in front of a computer for a lot of the day. So we don't want you to get too tired sitting there. So she'll do that this morning and then again this afternoon before our closing session. So feel free to join us for that as well. All you have to do is stay on here or click the link to join that later in the day. So without further ado, we want to welcome one of our sponsors for this event. We have Christina Weeder with the Kentucky Department of Education. She's the Director of the Division of Student Success in the Office of Continuous Improvement. I think that's got all of that right. She's also a member of our interagency advisory group and a wonderful advocate and asset to our students. So please join me in welcoming Christina Weeder with the Kentucky Department of Education.
Good morning. Thank you, Ronnie. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm in the office today for the first time in many months, so I just had to make sure that my audio and video is working correctly. We are so fortunate to be joined this morning by a leading expert in classroom management, Dr. Terry Scott. Dr. Scott is the co-program investigator for the Kentucky Academic and Behavioral Response to Intervention Project, or Kentucky ABRE, at the University of Louisville, and a nationally recognized leader in effective instruction and behavior research. Kentucky ABRE is the Kentucky Department of Education project that is focused on developing training and technical assistance in the basics of effective instruction and classroom management that formulate the universal levels of PBIS and RTI in the school and classroom. ABRE is structured to provide statewide access to support with the emphasis on creating an infrastructure toward sustainability and capacity building within schools and educational cooperatives. The goal is both to increase capacity in Kentucky and to evaluate academic and social outcomes for students across the state. So please welcome Dr. Terry Scott.
Good morning. Thank you, Christina, and welcome everybody. Let me try to share my screen here, which is always my challenge, is to figure out how to do something. Are you seeing my title slide right now?
No, we're not seeing it, Terry.
Okay, how about now?
There we go.
All right, great. Well, again, thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk with you this morning. I've got less than an hour, which is plenty because it's boring to sit and look at your computer screen. What I want to talk about during my brief time with you this morning is gambling. I'd like to talk about the things we do that we hope will make a difference with the kids we work with. My background is undergraduate degree in psychology, ended up working in residential treatment for years, got my degree then in special ed and became a self-contained EBD teacher for several years. And during that time, working directly with kids, it occurred to me that nothing we have works every time, and nothing we have works for every kid. But some things work better than others, and that's a gamble for us. So I want to talk about this in terms of probability. What are the things we could do that maximize probability for kid success? So I want to start off just by giving you a little context for the stuff that I'm going to show you and give you access to some resources. We run several projects through the Center for Instructional Behavior Research in Schools, and all of those projects involve the same set of basic things. We study how can adults do things that make it more likely that kids will be successful. So we talk a lot about effective instruction, about behavior support and behavior management, and all the things that need to be in place to make this work. We sometimes refer to the kids we're working with as being at risk. And I like that term. However, what we're finding is that it's not the kids that are at risk. The kids are only at risk because the environment isn't always doing what's necessary. So we, the environment, sometimes create that risk. So what we've been trying to do is create training and awareness for what could we, the adults in that environment, do to make it more likely that kids would be successful. And we're building right now a website, which is, as we speak, being worked on, where you'll be able to go in and click on the professional learning library. You can see there along the left are a bunch of categories, and you can click the categories you want. So you could say, I want behavior, but I want behavior and PBIS, or I want behavior and special ed, or whatever combination you want, and it'll take you to the set of videos we have on those topics. Most of those, if not all of those, say 0 right now because we're, again, in the process of building this. We have, I would guess, 50 to 70 videos already. We're just trying to rebuild this website to make it more user-friendly. So what we're going to talk about this morning is probability. And if you wanted to talk about 3 things that adults could do to maximize the probability of kid success, we'd be talking about instruction, behavior support, and relationships. So while I talk this morning, in order to make your mind think about probability, this is what I'm going to ask you to do. Let's pretend like I have all of your money. I have your retirement, I have your car, I have your bank account, I have everything you own. That's the bad news. The good news is I'm going to give you a chance to double it. Here's the bet. I got a classroom over here filled with middle school kids. You don't know them, but you know middle school kids. I've also got a brand new teacher. I plan to open the door to that classroom, throw that teacher in, shut the door behind, and lock it for 1 week. Here's the bet. We will watch that on video screen. So you can pretend like we're in some fancy casino at the sports book, but we're not watching football, we're watching that classroom. The bet is, if all of those kids stay on task 80% of the time, and nobody needs to be removed from the room, you double your money in 1 week. of course, if those things don't happen, you've lost everything. Now, if the stakes were that high for you your entire life, what would you want to see that teacher doing in that classroom? And if I think about it for myself, if everything I own is on this, I'm not just going to come up with a random list of things I'd like to see that teacher do. I want to know what the research says is our best chance for kids to be successful. Again, if I use anything that isn't my best chance, I'm lowering my chances of doubling my money and raising my chances of losing it all. Now, no matter how good that teacher is at managing instruction and behavior, we also have to realize that that teacher has to be good at dealing with kids that aren't always responsive to those things. And as you guys know better than anyone, there will be kids that are going to screw this up for us. There are going to be kids that aren't going to be on task 80% of the time, even when we use good practice. And there are going to be kids, in reality, that'll need bigger interventions. But let's talk about the things that, number one, are most likely to work across the board. And number two, how do we differentiate and intensify those things for individual kids? So let's go through the three areas we've got. Let's start with relationships. Relationships is the most difficult one to talk about because it's the hardest one to measure. And I'm not sure if we can teach this. In other words, if I'm working with an adult and that adult is constantly yelling at the kids and doesn't like kids and doesn't generate any feeling from the students that they care about them at all, it's probably not going to work very well. And I've found that it's really hard for me to go in and say, here's what it looks like to care about kids, because if they don't, they don't. But let's talk a little bit deeper about what we mean by relationship, because it doesn't mean every kid is your best friend. First, let's look at a logic. We know that when kids report that they think their teacher cares about them, even if that teacher is super strict, if they believe the teacher has their best interest at heart and is doing things because they care about them, they achieve better. So how do we do that if the teachers we work with maybe don't have a lot of that genuineness to begin with? Well, again, let me step back and say genuineness is a great thing. But without it, here's what we still have. We know that when teachers deliver effective instruction, that we have kids that get better scores. When teachers have more effective instruction, kids have fewer behavior problems. So effective instruction makes kids more successful. When kids are more successful, the teacher has an opportunity to say to them, hey, you did that right, good for you. And every time that happens, it makes there be a little bit more of a relationship. Now, again, it would be even better if this happened along with the genuineness. But the research that's out there says kids that are in classrooms where they're highly successful within the instruction and within the behavior support system, they report that they think their teacher likes them more and they like their teacher more and they achieve better. So effective instruction and management are two of the essential components of relationships. But there's more to it than that. So what we've been doing is looking at how adults and students interact. We decided to go outside the classroom. I'll show you some inside the classroom stuff in a little bit. We stood in hallways, entryways, cafeterias, locker areas, playgrounds, etc. at each school level. We looked for an adult and we observed what the adult was doing. The red bar here represents the percentage of time in which that adult was looking at the kids and supervising when they were in the common area. So you can see we're at 95%. That's good. The green bar is what percentage of that time were they engaging with the students in some way? Well, at elementary, it's only 17, at middle 11, and at high school 2. To me, this is opportunity lost. We're standing in an area, there are kids walking all around us. We have an opportunity to do and say things that end positively. There's a guy named Bob Pianta, famous researcher in teacher-student relationships, who says every single time a teacher and a student go back and forth and it ends positively, it's a better predictor for other good things, including achievement. So I asked him, what do you mean by positive? And essentially the answer is not negative. The number of times we can go back and forth with kids that doesn't end in a negative in some way is an increase in a probability for success. So right now, when I look at 2% at high school, I think there's a huge opportunity there to engage with kids. Well, what sometimes people will say to me at every level of school is, those kids don't want to be engaged with. Right, but if we know engaging with them increases the probability of success, then that's something we should be thinking about doing. It's like our kids a lot of times don't want to do math either, but that's not a reason for not teaching math. So what are the things we could do to engage them? It, again, doesn't mean being their best friend, but to say something to them that isn't simply feedback. So what we did was we looked at the statements teachers made during that 17%, 11%, and 2% to see what they were. And this is what it looks like. At the elementary level, it's almost 3-to-1 negative to positive, even at the elementary level. In the middle school, you can see positives hardly ever happen, but negatives do. And at high school, a strange thing is positives are higher there than they are anywhere else, but negatives go through the roof. In fact, if you factor this out, in the average high school that we've looked at, the teacher we're looking at says something positive every 4.3 minutes and something negative every 23 seconds. Those aren't long statements because, again, they all add up to only 2% of the time. So they're usually very quick. Thanks or stop. It's not instructional. If you were saying we needed to just have feedback, it's not very instructional when it's 1 or 2 words. And 2, we're missing a lot of opportunities here. So when I look at this one of the kind of things people might say is, well, I'd love to be more positive, but the kids don't do anything positive. And I guess I've got 2 responses to that. The first one is, I bet that's not true. I have been in a lot of schools and I'm constantly in schools everywhere I go, even when I'm in the state agency schools, the alternative schools, etc. Most of the kids are doing what they're supposed to do. Yeah, there are schools where more kids are doing things they're not supposed to, but still most of them are. So we don't have an opportunity to provide positives thing, I don't think holds water. The other part of that I would say is, generally I think people say they're not doing anything to warrant us saying something positive because it sounds like now we've got a task, we've got to be more positive. And I guess my argument would be, if you're right, the kids aren't doing anything positive, then I think the task before you is way bigger than simply saying, good job, I appreciate that, you did a nice job with that. That task is going to be way bigger. So what I urge you to do is to think, in your school where you work with kids, to what extent do you take the initiative to develop positive and genuine relationships with all your students? And again, that doesn't mean they're coming to your house for dinner. It means you have the ability to have a conversation with them, even if it's brief, that they know you have some care, genuine care about them. They have to believe that, even if it's not true. Let's go to the second part, behavior support. And we could talk about behavior support at a micro level. I'm going to talk about it at a macro level. So when we talk about behavior support, we're generally talking about systems. And we could talk about this like PBIS. And so I'd like to give you my down and dirty, what is PBIS? Because I think it's greatly misunderstood as something really big and really complicated, and it's not. It's a logic. It's a framework. So think about it like this. That triangle represents populations of kids. The first triangle is green, and that green triangle contains every single kid you work with. Now, what we want to do is we want to make those kids as successful as we possibly can. Now, I know, because I spent a lot of my career working in the kind of schools you work in, that what you need to do to make everybody successful is far greater than what the average school does. When I think back to my time working in an institution, I think we did a really good job, but what we did to make that work was really big and really structured at the school-wide level. So I want you to think about it like this. We've got a bunch of kids that are having failure. Let's call that failure, for our purposes today, gathering rust, literally. They're gathering rust and corrosion on their body, which is bad. An arm could just fall off if it corrodes badly enough. So what we're going to do is go around the school and think, where would kids get damp? Because if we can find areas where they get damp, we are finding areas that predict rust. So my suggestion is we go around the school with a moisture meter, find our damp areas, and all of those areas get painted with green rust-proof paint. We might as well just line the kids up in the hall and I'll paint them with rust-proof paint too. Now, rust-proof paint, green paint, is instruction. It's telling them what to do, when to do it, why to do it, how to do it, and for us giving reminders, etc., to make sure those things are more likely to happen. What we know, what you know really well, is that despite our best efforts and the best green paint we've got, there will be a set of kids who can rust right through a layer of green paint, and those kids, a smaller number, will also need super rust-proof paint, which comes in yellow. Now, somebody might ask, if yellow's better than green, why don't we use yellow at the start? Here's why. Yellow paint only works on top of a layer of green. Yellow paint isn't something you do instead of green, it's something you do on top of green. There will be some kids that need different extra. That's what yellow paint is. It's the extra things we do. And again, where you all work, that yellow paint has got to be more intensive than it would look like in a typical school. And as you are all very well aware, there's a number of kids out there, even when you're in an institution using really intensive green and yellow paint, there'll be some kids that are not responsive to that. And they're going to need super deluxe, incredibly impactful red paint. Why not use red paint instead of yellow and make this a two-tier triangle? Because red paint is prescription paint. When you go to Lowe's and say, I want red paint for some kids, they're going to say, wait, I need to know what that kid's issues are, when they have them, where they have them, what's going on with them, what are their skills, what are their deficits. Red paint is individualized paint. You're going to have to figure out what that paint looks like for each unique kid who needs it. But every kid getting red paint continues to get the yellow and the green. Red paint is another layer on top of this. When we do PBIS, we're doing 4 things. They're this simple. Predict. When will your kids have problems? Where? Doing what? Why? All right? If you know who's doing what, when, where, and why, then what's the simplest set of things we could do to prevent it? Green paint. Now, if we don't apply that green paint to everybody or every place, it's not going to work. So if half the adults in the school say, I'm going to remind kids, I'm going to teach this, we're going to set this up, and the other half go, yeah, whatever, It's not going to work. It would be like if half the teachers in your school said 2 + 2 = 4 and the other half said, or 5. It's not going to work. You've got to have consistency to have effective instruction. Then we need to measure. How are we going to know if this is working? You got to look, who's it working for, who's it not? And for those kids for whom it's not working, they're going to get the yellow paint, but we go back to box 1 and we say, among those kids that still aren't being successful, why, when, where, what's going on? And then we use that information to develop our yellow paint. In box 2, we do it consistently and we continue to monitor. When we go back through this with our red paint, it's one kid at a time. What are the predictable failures for that kid? What can we do to prevent failure for that kid? How do we maintain consistency for that kid? And what are we measuring for that kid? So here's some really simple examples. Here's a map of a school. I do this with schools all the time. I want you, each of you who work in this school, to take 2 sticky dots. The colors are irrelevant. I want you to write on that dot, those dots, the names of 2 problem behaviors that you personally witness when you work in this school. Don't write down what you think or what you've heard, write what you see. Put a time of day on your dot. When I say now, I'm going to throw a map up on the wall and you're going to come running up and stick it in the place you're thinking about. This is a school in Kentucky, and you can see they're all thinking about the cafeteria and the hallway. That doesn't mean we don't need to talk about the courtyard or the kitchen or wherever other kids might go. It means this is where we're going to make the biggest difference. So I would look at the dots and say, when in the cafeteria, doing what in the cafeteria, and then let's talk to everybody. You guys all said that it's loud and messy with horrible manners at lunchtime. Why? And let people say it's because there's too many kids. It's because we have a bad seating arrangement. It's because we haven't taught rules. It's because, what is it? Then what could we do to fix that? Which becomes our box 2. This allows us to be very structured and very systematic in making sure we cover predictable failures. Second, let's think about teaching those things to our kids. What we know is teaching kids a list of 50 rules will not be effective. So what we've said in PBIS is come up with some big ideas like respect yourself, others, and property, or be responsible, be respectful. These kind of big ideas. Teach kids what those things mean. We call those anchors. Now what you do is you say, remember our big anchor, respect others. Here are some things you should be thinking about when we go into the hallway. Why do you think we need to stay to the right when in the hallway? How does that respect others? Notice that what we're doing now, instead of saying, shut up and read this list of 50 things, we're teaching. We've got a concept. We can engage kids in that concept. We can get them to think through it and talk about it. That is the instruction that makes this stick. We've got a ton of research out there that says when you teach kids the rules by creating an anchor and using that anchor to talk about what and why, kids remember what to do instead of what not to do, and they remember more of the things. That's why we do it this way. Now, what we want to do then is teach kids what to do. What I keep seeing in schools is they've gone through this and then they put up reminders for kids that say what not to do. And it's just not logical. I think the sign on the left from a school is as ridiculous as the sign on the right from somewhere. I found this on the internet. It's equally as silly. I guarantee you, 99.9% of the kids in your school know that hitting, kicking, and pushing is wrong. Why do they do it? It works, and they don't have a better strategy right now. So simply saying don't doesn't make it go away. The logic here would be, if we were teaching math, no one would say, here are 12 numbers that aren't the answer to anything today. Memorize those, because that doesn't do any good in terms of teaching what is the answer or how to solve it. What we want a school to do is to come up with a curriculum. We sometimes call it a matrix. It's a curriculum. We want to be in this school respectful, responsible, and on time. Here's what the definition of that is, and here's what that looks like in these different areas. Notice that the classroom column is blank, and that's because every classroom teacher needs to be able to make their own classroom rules. Now, those classroom rules should not contradict anything else we've got going on in the school. And in order for kids to understand why your rules are different, you connect them back to the big ideas. Hey, I teach art. In art, in order to be respectful, we do these things. Now, I realize when you're in language arts, it's different. But here's why we have this rule for being respectful in here. As long as you can make that case logical in a way the kids can see, you can have different rules in each classroom. What we want then is to take data on these things and say, is it working? For some reason my thing doesn't want to change. Here's data. If we're keeping data on what's happening, we can answer questions. Where are our problems happening? When are our problems happening? Where are our problems happening? What are our problems? And now you can answer questions like, if our biggest problem, according to this one here, would be tardy, what time of day would a tardy be most likely to occur? And we can ask, does a tardy more likely occur when kids are leaving a certain classroom or going to a certain classroom? By using our data, every time we get to that box 4, how do we know it's working? We can say, it is working here, but it's not working here. And we answer the question, why? And now we know what to tweak when we go back to box 1 and talk about predictors. So the data, box 4, does 2 things for us. It tells us whether it's working, and it tells us what we should do to go on to the next part. Now, we like to assess whether PBIS is actually happening, and there are a number of ways you could do this. One of the ways we do it is through something we call the PBIS walkthrough. And it's a very quick 20-minute zip through and say, are these things in place? They either are or they're not. Again, we can do this with the tiered fidelity inventory, the school effectiveness tool, the ABRI assessment that we have, but those are all longer instruments that we try to use once or twice a year. This is a quick one. But what we found in our research on this is that the score schools get on this quick and simple instrument is a great predictor of suspensions. Now, for a lot of you, suspensions isn't one of the things you deal with because for a lot of you, suspensions aren't something that can happen. But if we know it reduces suspension, we know it's reducing misbehavior, because suspension is the best larger index we have of behavior, because it's standardized across schools what kids can be suspended for. But the big idea here is we know that the data we get on this from a school tells us how successful that school might be. So I want to stop here and just have you think, to what extent do you take a systems approach to teaching expected behaviors in the way that I just talked? What simple things could we do to enhance and increase the probability of student success in that realm? Again, you're trying to win a bet. It's not just a simple bet. It's a bet for everything you own. So these questions are extremely important when you think about your money riding on it. Now, the reality is your money's not riding on it, but kid success is. And so there is still a reason for us to be really, really thoughtful about how well we're doing these things. Lastly, effective instruction. I would make the argument that effective instruction was what we were doing when we talked about behavior support. We were just talking about a systems approach to doing effective instruction for behavior. But I'm going to drill down into the components of instruction for this part. We've got a ton of evidence for this. It's been around for at least 50, probably 70 years. Here's what is absolutely crystal clear. We get our biggest effects for kid achievement. And along with kid achievement is self-esteem and confidence. We get those when the teacher is clear and explicit with the lesson content and contextualizes it for the learner. This is what that means. Be crystal clear. Here's what we're learning today. Here's why we're doing that. Here's what we did yesterday. Here's how it connects. Here's where we're going with it. Now, why would you care? How does this fit into your world? So here's where I want to be really context specific. And this is where a lot of the culturally responsive practices come in, is you're going to be clear and explicit regardless. But what examples will you use and how will you talk about this given the kids that you work with? If you use as your rationale for why we're doing this, because I said so, because the principal said so, or because it's the next thing in the book, you won't be able to grab kids with it. Being explicit means making it clear why we're doing it and why you should care. Second, it's the teacher's responsibility to make the kids be interested and engaged. By engaged, we mean we want them thinking and doing, not sitting and passively getting like you're doing right now. We want lots of opportunities for kids to think and do. Third, when the kids are getting lots of chances to think and do, we're walking around giving lots of feedback. And we should be giving more positive than negative feedback. If you're finding that you can't give more positive than negative, it means what we're doing on number 1 and number 2 were not good enough and they need to be enhanced. Now, according to a guy named John Hattie, whose world is studying probabilities, or what we call effect sizes, of interventions, he refers to this as direct instruction. I know direct instruction fairly well. I wouldn't necessarily call these 3 things that, but on the other hand, I don't really care what we call it. The effect size is 0.59, and it doesn't even matter if that's good or not good. Here's what we should be asking. Is there any way to do this that gives you a bigger effect? And the answer is very clearly no. We have the data on all the other ways of delivering instruction, and none of them are even close. So here's what we did. We said, let's go out and watch classrooms, and let's use those observations to see what teachers are doing. So we've now done this over 14,000 times. We walk into a classroom, we sit in the back, and we watch instruction. We don't watch when they're taking roll. We don't watch when they're getting set up. We don't watch independent work or practice. We only code during instruction. So when we go do this, we go and watch every teacher in a school, and we randomly select a target kid, and we code the gender and ethnicity of the teacher and the student. So here's one. Just those 3 things: active instruction, being explicit and contextualizing, opportunities to respond, meaning how many times did the teacher give the kids a chance to do or say something, and how many times did the teacher say or gesture or in some way signal an affirmation that a kid did something right. We then did an analysis to see how many unique clusters we get of teachers. And it comes up with 3 clusters. Now we can use those clusters to predict kid behavior. And here's what we found. If I go into a school and go into a classroom and watch a teacher teach for 10 minutes, if during that 10 minutes of instruction, the teacher uses those 3 practices in the lower third of all teachers we've ever seen, you can predict right now the kids in that room are 27% more likely to be off task and 67% more likely to be disruptive. You are far more likely to lose your money on that bet if teachers aren't doing those things. So we've looked at this in a number of ways because, again, A lot of what I study is what you could call gambling or handicapping. How do we know how likely it is kids will be successful? And what we can clearly see is you cannot predict kids' success by their ethnicity, by their age, by their income level, or by any of those other kid factors. So again, when I say kids are at risk, what I mean is there are certain populations of kids who get different than other kids do. The risk comes from the environment. So let's take a deeper dive. When we talk about engagement, we're talking about the things we do to keep kids engaged. And believe me, I know the kids that many of you work with are more difficult to engage. We have to think harder about what kinds of things do I have that'll work for that group of kids. So everybody raise your hand if you agree. Everybody thumbs up, thumbs down. Put 1 to 5 fingers up on how much you feel like you get this. Turn to your neighbor and tell them what you think. Draw one of those and hold it up for everybody, and you can just be creative and think of a million other ways. At the same time, as I think about all those, I can think of some classes I worked with where I wouldn't use that one. I don't know if that would have worked, but I'd probably use this one instead. And so you have to be thoughtful about how you engage kids. So the question isn't, should we engage kids? Because the answer to that is, it's probably the biggest effect size we've got. It's how do you need to make that happen? The evidence we have from our research and others says that at about 3 OTRs per minute during instruction, not all day long, at about 3 OTRs per minute during instruction, you get significant engagement from kids, active engagement, and you get significant decreases in disruptive behavior. So we know that using 3 is your best chance of success. Yet the data that you see before you is what we actually see out there in the real world. So we wrote a book simply on the idea that we've looked at 4,000 classrooms 14,000 classrooms, and we don't see people using the strategies that we would say are our biggest effect. If we were betting our own money on this, we would be losing our own money on this. That's just a fact. And as I repeatedly say, I put a lot, if not all, of the blame for this on higher education because I don't think we're teaching our teachers to do this. It's that effective. It should be one of our biggest things. Let's go to feedback. Again, there's a John Hattie barometer there at the bottom that says the effect of saying yes when someone does it right is 3/4 of a standard deviation, a giant 0.73 effect. Here's the problem. We've got something that gives you that big of an effect. You don't even get to use it ever unless the kids do something right, which is why effective instruction has to precede the effective use of feedback. If we're not using effective instruction, then we're not able to use lots of positives. So if we're not using high rates of positives and we believe it's because kids aren't earning or deserving of them, it means our instruction's not good enough and we need to go back and redo our instruction. It needs to be more explicit in a way that's more relevant for the kids we're talking about. And it needs to be more engaging in a way that's relevant for the kids we're talking about and working with. So what does it mean to give feedback? And I operate from a very behavioral perspective, and I've operated with a token economy in every classroom I've ever worked in because it was necessary for the structure I required. At the same time, I hate a token economy. If I taught again in the same kind of room I used to, I would use one again. But this is what we're talking about. Affirmation. Hey, I saw you do that right. I'm impressed. You should feel proud. Good for you. Thanks. Yes, correct. Or a lot of times say, hey, adults, use your words. That's all we're talking about. When we talk about PBIS and we talk about positive classrooms, it's not about giving things away. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ever give things away. It means that shouldn't be what you rely on. The you being able to say, I saw you do that right and I'm impressed, is part of relationship building. It's a double whammy. It makes them more confident And it gives you the credit for doing something right when actually you're giving the credit back to them. In fact, this is the way I define being a teacher. Teachers create circumstances, sometimes by playing tricks and setting traps and saying things in a certain way and using certain examples, but they create a set of circumstances to make the probability of kids' success greater, and then they give all the credit for that back to the kid. That's what being a teacher is. So if you think about this logically, we know when we're more positive, kids are more positive. So we can look at this in a lot of ways, but here's the data. This is, again, back to these thousands of classrooms that we've looked at, and this is data that was cleaned and analyzed and published. At the elementary school, and this is the average elementary school, the ratio is 3-to-1, which is a little low, but it doesn't matter even if the ratio was high because the frequency is incredibly low. So if you're using 100-to-1, but it only happens once every 10 years to get to that, it's not a good ratio. I mean, it's a good ratio, but it's not a good frequency, so it isn't going to matter. On the other hand, if you're using a giant amount of feedback, high frequencies, but the ratio is far more negative than positive, it won't work. You need both. And look across here, what you see is by the time we get to high school, and this is over almost 2,000 unique high school classrooms we've looked at, the average high school classroom, that kid hears as much positive as they do negative. And a lot of times what I might hear back on that is, well, those kids are already really successful, so they don't need a lot of positives. That would make sense, but I disagree that in 2,000 classrooms that we've looked at, that's the case. It's not, because those aren't the schools we typically go to look at. So here's another piece of quick data. These are all schools in Kentucky, 22 Title I elementary schools. 11 of them have distinguished reading scores on the state assessment, and a matched sample of 11 have needs improvement. We sat in every single classroom and looked at what every single teacher was doing. When we did the analysis, this is what we found. The only significant difference in classrooms was group OTR, which means number of times the teacher gave the entire group a chance to do something. Everybody, write that down. Everybody turn to your neighbor. Everybody hold one up. Everybody. In fact, here's how big it was. The average kid sitting in that distinguished Title I school gets more than 260 extra chances to respond to instruction per week. There's the only difference between high and low achievement. It's what a teacher does. And so we come back to this over and over. The best, and in some circumstances, the only good predictor we have of what kids will do is what the teacher does. And here's a final one to think about. This is brand new, and this is from JCPS. This was just accepted for publication. Looking at nothing but OTR across schools was a significant negative predictor for suspension. Looking at just positive feedback, same thing. If you put the two together, at the school level, the degree to which teachers in a school use group OTR and positive feedback is a statistically significant predictor of the percentage of students that are proficient and distinguished in reading and math. And that's a big predictor. So I'm going to come back and ask one more time. To what extent do we provide effective instruction as part of what we do with the teaching of what we do all day long every day? Are we explicit in a way that's culturally responsive, in a way that makes sense and is contextual for our kids? Are we engaging with our kids? Are we finding ways to engage them that'll work in the context we have for what we're teaching and the kids we're teaching? And are we providing feedback on a regular basis that's largely positive because the explicit part and the engaging part were done well? If it's not, it doesn't mean you failed as a teacher or it's your fault. It simply means I've got some data that indicates something's got to be done differently. That's part of being a teacher, is being able to look at data and make decisions. Again, I've taught my entire career basically as a teacher with kids in segregated settings that have had adjudication and a whole lot of issues in their life, trauma, etc. And I know it's a bigger challenge. But every bit of evidence we have says what we need to do for that group of kids is the same thing we're doing for others, only with more intensity and probably with better differentiation because of the types of kids we have. So let me sum this up. You are incredibly important. When you walk into that school every day, the things you do make a giant difference. I mean, you really, really do. You have a huge impact on the probability of success for each of those kids. Now, again, if they fail, that does not mean it was your fault. That's gonna happen. But we know we control some of the probability. Second, instruction matters. Instruction should be the hallmark of what we do when we teach academics and behavior. Good instruction makes a difference for kids' success. And third, there are a million things out there you could try. It's overwhelming how many, I'm making quote marks with my fingers, evidence-based practices there are. Let's just assume they really are all evidence-based, even though I don't think that's necessarily true. Rather than look for what's evidence-based, look for among the things that claim to be evidence-based, which ones have data indicating they make the biggest difference. Because one evidence-based practice that makes a small difference and another evidence-based practice that makes a big difference aren't equal. Some things work better than others. And again, if you go back to what are the top things we could think about in terms of big ideas, they are effective instruction, behavior support, and relationships. When you unpack those, there are a whole bunch of other little things in there. But what we're always trying to think about and look for are, what could I do to maximize the probability of that kid's success? And always think, what if I was betting my own money on this? What would I want to see? What would I think is my best chance? So that's the way I like to think about this. That's the way I approach it when I go into classrooms now. And I think the evidence for it is, I've showed you evidence mainly that we've collected because I want you to see the Kentucky data and the stuff we're doing. But nationally, the data looks the same. This is what we see. So I'd be happy to answer any questions in the remaining minutes we have, if anybody has questions. I don't have a chat available to me that I see here. So if there is somebody asking a question by chat, could somebody relay that to me?
I don't really have a question yet because that was a lot of information to process.
Well, if you do have a question later, here's my email address. I want to make clear I have nothing for sale. So if you are contacting me, if I have something that you can use and I have ownership of it, you can have it. Again, we're trying to put as much as we can up on that website, but I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions anybody has ever via email. And if we need to talk in a different way, we can do that too. And again, this is part of our job, and I'm happy to do that.
Dr. Scott, we do have, I know that you guys are working in some of the A6 programs in the juvenile justice centers across Kentucky. Could you talk a little bit about your experience in those particular programs?
We've been in a few of those programs at different times, and one of our staff on Kentucky ABRE, Diane Clare, works directly with some of those programs. We really don't do anything differently when we're in those places than we do anywhere else, other than we realize we're in a place where what we do to make these things work will necessarily be unique. And sometimes that means more intensive, and other times it just means different. But we also have quite a bit of data from those schools and nationally that the things I just talked about have as big an effect on our state agency schools, our alternative settings, as they do anywhere else. And one of the, I guess, maybe arguments that I've heard before is, well, our school is all the red zone, so we don't need to do the green and the yellow. But that's not logical, because the reality is once all those kids are together in that school, again, most of them get along fine within the system you've got. Some need more and some need a lot. But what we want to do is not assume that every kid is the biggest problem, but put things in place to minimize and prevent problems so that we can hold some of our effort back for the kids that need more. But again, when I go through, here's what PBIS is, and teach it step by step how to do it, it isn't any different in a early childhood school or an alternative high school. But the little practices we'd put together within those steps are going to look different necessarily.
Dr. Scott, what advice would you have for our administrators who are on here who are in the process of hiring new teachers? What kind of advice would you give them in looking for those new teachers, or retraining or working with and providing growth plans for all of our teachers in our system? What advice would you offer in that process?
Well, that is a really good question that I'm afraid of answering, but I'm going to try. I guess first, if I were going to work again in a classroom, and I haven't been full-time in a classroom since a long time ago, I would be nervous going in again, even though I'm in classrooms working on a very regular basis. I think humility is important, that there's always something to learn. I can be better at things. I think I work with kids with emotional behavior disorders really well. I think that's something I have a knack for, or at least I've done it enough that I'm comfortable with it. But at the same time, there are things I know I can do better. So I think when hiring a teacher, what I want to hear is, I've got a lot of skills, but I know I need to work on things. There are things I want to work on, and I would like my administrator to help me set goals and help me work toward improving those things. The person who thinks, I've done this for a long time, I know everything, I think is going to be much more difficult to work with. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't someone out there who's perfect at everything, because maybe there is. But I think as a generality, I would be wanting to look for people who want to improve. And then you can piggyback right on that. As I said, I think teaching adults is exactly the same as teaching kids. So as an administrator, I want to be that instructional leader. So I want to talk with my teachers, and I want to observe my teachers. I want to give them lots of chances to talk to me about what they're doing, and I want them to get lots of feedback. I want them to set goals, and I want the feedback that I give them to be feedback that tells them how they're progressing toward those goals. Everything I just said is exactly the same as what I'd say about how do we teach kids. We know those things give us big effects. So I want teachers that are not just willing, but understanding of the importance of continuous improvement. And I want to think, how do I create my building in such a way that I am working with teachers to set goals, provide formative assessment, and coaching as necessary to keep improving those important things.
Thank you for that. I have one final question before we have to end this session. And this comes from one of our folks out in the field. How can you empower teachers to give their peers feedback when they're not necessarily the instructional leader or the positive mentor in the building?
Another really good question. And if I had the absolute answer to that, I'd be wealthy. That is a great question. And actually, we have a multi-million-dollar research grant right now trying to answer some of that. but this is what we do know. In order to make PLCs or peer tutoring groups among adults work, you have to have a few things. One is it's non-evaluative. All I'm doing is coming into your room and watching you and recording what you want me to record from you. And then I'm giving you back that information. You put it on a graph, and we in groups or teams of two or whatever discuss, if I wanted that to be higher, what kinds of things could I try? What reminders would there be? So I'm not asking my peers to evaluate me. There's simply a set of steps we need to go through. And what my peers can do is help me gather information and think through things. Now, that's best case scenario. What we keep finding when we've tried this multiple times is that it goes away really quickly. Teachers watch each other once and then they talk and then things get going and it never happens again. In order for anything to be effective, it needs to be sustainable. So again, I think whether this is PLCs or teachers with teachers or external coaches, et cetera, this needs to come back to an administrator as leadership of, this is what we're doing. This is how we're going to do this. This is the expectation. Now, again, it's not supposed to be evaluative, but I will evaluate whether you're following through with the process or not. So, and again, that's just based upon what we're doing and seeing. We're currently looking at developing a couple of different possibilities for seeing if we can make this sustain better, but I believe it will come back to effective leadership.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. We're just a couple of minutes over here, but I want to thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for coming and spending this hour with us. What amazing information that you shared with us. And every time I hear you present and share the resources that you have, it's just a further reminder of the great work that's taking place, but also how much more effective we can continue to be. It's that mindset of continuous improvement. I think that you have really instilled throughout this presentation, and I'm willing to risk. I'm gonna let it ride, I guess, in our gambling theme. I'm gonna let it ride on these teachers and our folks who are out in the field who are doing a great job. I think Donna Puryear really summed it up in her comments in the chat session, which you couldn't see, but she said, "My goodness, the power of the classroom teacher."
Yep.
The power of the classroom teacher. It's amazing. Thank you for all you're doing to help us. Thank you to all of our folks out there. We appreciate your time this morning. Dr. Scott, as you stop sharing your screen, I'm going to